Hello. Today I'd like to take a look at something that's again near and dear to my heart. The topic of grandiosity. Why do some of us hate people who are grandiose? And what does this mean, grandiosity, anyway? And why are some people arguably hardly at all grandiose, but perhaps quite violent? And you don't tend to see, in my mind, a mix of the two. You might find quite a bit of violence in some people or quite a bit of grandiosity in others, but rarely both at the same time, at least to big proportions. So what even do we mean by grandiosity? Well, I've had the following thoughts. That first off, if one thinks one's grandiose, so what? If one thinks thus that the one's better than everyone else in some trait, so what? And in what trait in particular? I think really what bugs a lot of us, if we complain about someone saying someone's grandiose, is not what they think of themselves, but rather what that person is subtly but surely saying about you and me, everyone else out there. Not that they think they're better than you and me in some way, but that they also at the same time think we're much less, to the extent we're basically trivial or cow dung. We're worthless. So, what does it matter to you and me what someone estimates their own talents to be in their own room, for instance? Or let's say they're living under the surface of Mars and they think they're really hot stuff. Well, so what? That doesn't bug you and me, right? What bugs us is what's being said under the surface. What they're saying about you and me as being trivial or here's the crux, useless. That what they're saying impacts our self-esteem. It makes us feel useless to other people. It's an attack on our self-esteem, I would say. I'd further say then that this is often being used as a kind of subtle weapon, especially by people who aren't given to violence. And so if they're not using violence physically, either through their muscles, let's say, or through guns, or through the use of power, then maybe they're using the tool of destroying someone else's self-esteem. You could call this then a defense mechanism, that some people might want to use violence as a defense mechanism to get what they want, to protect themselves, while some others use what you'd call grandiosity, but actually put-downs, to try and lower someone else's self-esteem so they have more power. They're not using violence, they're using words, they're using ideas to destroy or greatly lower someone else's self-esteem and therefore have power over them, or to feel less threatened, or simply to protect themselves from violent people. So the next question I would have then is, why do so-called arrogant or grandiose, or people we might say are full of themselves or arrogant or stuck up, why do such people bug certain people and not others? Well, I'd say it has a lot to do with how vulnerable a person might be to their self-esteem being attacked by someone else. Some people are much more vulnerable to this than others, either because they may not have much to offer others and they're being reminded of it, or they may be narcissists, so to speak, and believe they have such great talents that don't exist perhaps, but are so strongly believing of it that they could care less what anyone else says about them and their assets. And so you could say grandiose people's comments or put-downs about them doesn't bug them. It's the people with low self-esteem, for whatever reason, that feel the most bugged by put-downs, by the grandiose in some people. Now, why would an attack on someone's self-esteem hurt so much to some? My opinion these days is that it's precisely because this whole idea of self-esteem at the root is about our desire, our need as human beings to feel useful to others, at least some people, or at least one person. I'm reminded, for instance, of a man, Jonathan Milligan, who has videos and courses trying to help people discover their talents and then market them. And he's said that sometimes he has a bad day, let's say giving a lecture, and maybe he gets a lot of negative comments. But he's said that what picks him up, so to speak, emotionally, is knowing that he can always go home and that his wife will be the one person who will always support him. So I suppose self-esteem to me means knowing that there's at least one person out there you feel useful to, so that they can be your ally. They're always in your corner, or most of the time. And I would say to almost all of us human beings, this is very important, to feel useful to at least someone, so that we have an ally, so that we have help. We don't have to go it all alone in life. I, for instance, love this one movie, The Horse Whisperer, with Robert Redford and a couple other wonderful actresses. And at one point, Robert Redford is asked, "Are you afraid of anything?" by a young gal who he's helping overcome a handicap. And he said yes, while playing the role of someone as a rancher who was perhaps 70 or 75. That one thing he said he's afraid of is not being useful anymore, being useless. In other words, useless to all people, so that he has no allies anymore. And the only person really that I've heard discuss how to live life without allies is Ralph Waldo Emerson in his famous essay on self-reliance. Probably a 20-page paper that's also available for viewing or listening to on YouTube, by the way. Very interesting, about a 1-hour show to listen to, whereby Ralph Waldo Emerson talks about how most people are not very self-reliant. So I suppose this would be one of two ways of living: to either feel some comfort as we go along in life with its challenges, by having at least one person we feel valuable to, so that we can depend on them for assistance, especially whether soothing or information or other ways, when we need it, especially when our back's against the wall. Or you could say, forget all that, I'm just going to be my own person, my own man, for whatever reason. Maybe some people just don't have many assets at all. No good looks, no money, and perhaps some toxic personality traits thrown in too. So they may decide to just isolate themselves from the whole world and be totally self-reliant, like Ralph Waldo Emerson talks about. Well, that may be an option, but it strikes me that that takes quite a bit of fortitude and brain power. Maybe a little cash on hand, too. So anyway, I see that as an option, but not for most people. So for most people, they want to have a feeling that they're useful to some people so others can come to their aid, especially in times of hardship. But then that's the crux of self-esteem, isn't it? Self-esteem being to feel valuable to at least one person. Let's say your spouse, hopefully. Not in all cases, though. Or here's the crux then. What power someone can have over us if they can get us to feel we're not valuable, if they can attack our self-esteem by being grandiose. And again, I would say that grandiosity has nothing to do with someone's inflated opinion of themselves that's not accurate, but rather the underlying message of how they deem you or me to be much less. And by much less, I mean so much less that they're saying you have no worth to anybody, not even your spouse. Well, that's quite a bit of power they have then, isn't it, to be able to say that? And then there's the rub, isn't it? That if one doesn't have the power of force, of having what society calls power, muscles, big size, a lot of clout with money or political power, or the willingness to be violent, then what better weapon can one alternatively use for whatever purpose is often protective even, than to attack someone else's self-esteem by what we call being grandiose? I would throw in a little humor and irony too, to say that sometimes, in my opinion, those most vulnerable to being put down, if you will, by such messages by so-called grandiose people are those with less than stellar intelligence to decode these subtle messages in the first place. And sometimes these people may just happen to be the most violent people out there. Whereas the most intelligent people, in certain manner, may be able to pick up on such subtle messages quite quickly. But then ironically be this same person to want to use that as a tool, the put down, the grandiose attitude. So you might find, in fact, people who most use grandiosity being those who are disadvantaged in size. They might be quite frail or small in size. Or, here's a biggie, in my opinion, perhaps their moral code doesn't allow them to use violence as a means of either protection or getting something they very much value in life. Either their basic human needs or more, something they're addicted to, in fact. Maybe their moral code says, "Thou shalt not kill," or perhaps even, "Thou shalt not kill under any circumstances," almost. Period. Well, then that can be kind of a dilemma for some people when their back is against the wall. If their moral code says, "Thou shalt not do this and thou shalt not do that ever, 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 ever," then what? Then I suppose what these moral codes tend not to prohibit is to use the power of grandiosity as a way of providing both control, protection, getting what you need, or maybe don't need but really crave. For instance, even in the Bible, the Christian Bible, it says in the 10 Commandments, "Thou shalt not kill." But where does it say, "Thou shalt not be grandiose"? I suppose then, to the morally elevated person, shall we say, it's much more preferable to use the power of putting down someone else's self-esteem by being grandiose, by implying to others subtly that they have no worth to anyone, and thus lowering their morale, if you will, depressing them, so to speak. That's not a sin, so to speak, in the 10 Commandments, is it? So I find that very interesting. Now, I would wrap this up by just throwing in one more possible way of living life. That, of course, I've talked of how most all of us want to feel valuable to at least one person. Ideally, you would say your spouse, your companion, your best friend. Having at least one good friend you can always call up at 2 a.m. Or there may be a few who I suppose society might call loners or self-reliant, to the extent talked about by Ralph Waldo Emerson. And I have no problem with that if you can pull it off. It's quite valuable as a way of living. Or, of course, you could simply adopt the policy of getting what you want by being violent and not care a hoot about being valuable to others. Just seize what you want. Just steal for it. Kill for it. I suppose the extreme example then being some of the henchmen working for Al Capone in the 1930s during the Prohibition. They could care less being valuable to anyone. They simply seized what they want with their guns. But of course there's downsides to that. They get no emotional soothing, for instance, from anyone. They may get their needs met, be able to have money to buy food, get housing, etc., but sit all alone in a room, basically, which is, of course, anybody could say, not an ideal way to live, is it? Now, I suppose at this point in my life I would say the answer I'm gravitating toward is a mix of feeling valuable to at least 1 or 2 people, perhaps your tribe, so to speak, your niche that values you in some way. But also having an element of self-reliance mixed in too, so that you know, deep down, that even if nobody likes you, nobody at all, it would be nice to feel that we can still get our basic human needs met somehow. Somehow. By craftiness of mind, shall you say. The Ralph Waldo Emerson approach in self-reliance. Or third, and here's something I'm looking into big time these days, a third alternative being so fearless about death that you accept it so well that deep down you don't need to feel valuable to anyone. You don't need self-esteem. You don't need backup. You don't need assistance from anyone to avoid death, basically, ultimately. Because you accept it so well. Maybe you don't crave death, but you accept it as inevitable. You don't fear it. You don't catastrophize it. And likewise then, you don't have to have such a strong emphasis on self-reliance, do you? To protect your life, if you aren't catastrophizing death itself so badly anyway. Now to me, this would be an ideal mix. To have a feeling of value to some, at least one person, and to have some self-reliant feelings should no one come to your backup. But third, what you would call the spiritual approach, whereby even if no one would come to your aid, and you can't be self-reliant either to provide your own needs yourself, that at least you accept possible death as a result. What people used to say we feared most in life, being excommunicated from the tribe for not conforming. And perhaps then this is a modern day crisis for us all, isn't it? With the decline of traditional religions offering an afterlife, or you might say a way never to die. That with the decline of this, that we have striven more and more to have either high self-esteem, a feeling of value to others so that they'll come to our aid, or more self-reliance, let's say through piling up a lot of money in the bank, whereby if nobody likes you, you could buy your way out of problems. There will always be someone willing to come to your aid if you pay them, in other words. But this last element, the spiritual element, the feeling that you need not worry about it if you'll never die, well, that's declining. Maybe we need a renewed effort in our lives, in our society, in the world, to either gain more traction, more confidence that there is an afterlife, or learn how to accept death without it. Better accept it. And so this is where I'm at my life anyway. And I just bring up these ideas because I think it's a very big set of concepts we all grapple with, but we don't seem to really understand that well in general, just bits and pieces. I wish you a good day.